Hello, and welcome back to Baby Elias's Stories. We now return to Snuff by Terry Pratchett, Part 14. Next day, the family went home, which is to say that Sybil and young Sam went home to Ankh-Morpork on a fast coach, after a small hiatus which led to young Sam's growing collection being removed from inside the coach and strapped to the roof. While Sam Vimes took the black-eyed Susan back to the hall, because there was still a matter of business to be concluded. Since he was a king of the river, the pilot let him steer for part of the way, admittedly staring obsessively over his shoulder just in case. And Vimes had fun, an infrequent event. It is a strange thing to find yourself doing something you have apparently always wanted to do, when in fact up until that moment you had never known that you had always wanted to do it, or even what it was. But Sam Vimes, for a moment upon the world, was a riverboat pilot and was as happy as a cat full of sixpences. That night he lay alone in the vastness of Ramkin Hall, except, of course, for the 100 or so servants, turning the events of the previous week over and over in his head, and especially his own actions during them. Time and again he cross-examined himself mercilessly. Had he cheated? Not exactly. Had he misled? Not exactly. Had he acted as a policeman should? Well, now that was the question, wasn't it? In the morning, 2 young maids brought him his breakfast, and Vimes was amused to see that they were accompanied by a footman as a chaperone. In a way, he found that rather flattering. Then he went for a walk through the lovely countryside, listening to the liquid notes of the robin, etc. He couldn't remember the names of the others, but they were jolly good singers all the same. And as he walked, he was aware of eyes upon him from every cottage and field. 1 or 2 people came up to him, shook him frantically by the hand, and ran away just as quickly. And it seemed to Vimes that the world was dragging around after him. Nervousness was so saturating the atmosphere that he felt that any time soon he should shout "Boo!" at the top of his voice. But Vimes was merely waiting for the evening. The coaches started to arrive at Ankh-Morpork's Opera House very early. This was going to be an important occasion. It was said that not only the patrician would be there, but that he would be accompanied by Lady Margolota, ruler of all Uberwald, plus the dwarf ambassador, and the black ruby viceroy of Diamond King of Trolls, who arrived in the city with almost as many courtiers, secretaries, bodyguards, chefs, and advisors as had been brought by the ambassador from the dwarves. In an unsophisticated way, the people of Ankh-Morpork were very sophisticated, and the streets buzzed more busily than usual. Something like this was important. Great matters of state would be settled over the canopies. The fate of millions and such like would be almost likely decided by a quiet word in a corner somewhere, and thereafter the world would be a slightly different place. You see if it isn't. Unless you had a gold-edged invitation to the opera house that evening, this was no occasion to be fashionably late. In case you were left fashionably standing fashionable at the back, craning unfashionably to see over the heads of other people. Toward sunset, Vimes lounged outside the lockup, happy to acknowledge the fraternal salute of the pilot of a small boat that sailed past. Then he strolled along the lane until he reached the pub and took a seat on the bench outside. He took out his snuff box, looked at it for a moment, and decided that on an occasion like this, Sybil would have probably allowed him a cigar. Through the smoke of the first luxurious pool, he stared at the village green, and most especially at that pillar of what seemed to be broken wickerwork. Somehow, soundlessly, it was speaking to him, calling to him, just as it had when he had first seen it. After a few more thoughtful puffs, he wandered toward the pub door. Jiminy beamed at him from under the freshly painted sign of the Commander's Arms, where he was enjoying the pint that the parsimonious publican drinks every day when cleaning the pipes. Parsimonious, exhibiting or marked by parsimony, especially frugal to the point of stinginess, sparing, restrained, parsimonious. Jiminy beamed at him from under the freshly painted sign of the Commander's Arms, where he was enjoying the pint that the parsimonious, where he was enjoying the pint that the parsimonious publican drinks every day when cleaning the pipes. It's old beer, obviously. But what's beer but liquid bread, eh? And bread can't do you no harm. "You look a bit preoccupied, Commander," said the publican. "A mite pensive, as it were." Vimes nodded toward the tottering spire. "How important is that, my friend?" The barman glanced at the stack as if he couldn't care less. "Well, you know it's just a load of old wicker hurdles, that's all. They just stack them there after the annual sheep fair, so they don't get in the way. A bit of a landmark, you might say, but not that much." "Oh," said Vimes. He stared at the tower. Nothing really, then, but nevertheless, it spoke to him. Vimes stared at the heap for a while, and then followed Jiminy into the bar. "How much brandy do you have in here?" "Not much call for it, but I'd say 5 or 6 bottles in a small barrel." Jiminy stared intently at Vimes. Vimes knew Jiminy for what he was, nothing else but a man who knew enough to always be on the winning side. Vimes puffed his cigar again. "Put 2 of them aside for me, will you? And you better make sure you've got good beer on tap, because pretty soon you're going to have a lot of customers." He left the barman bustling as he went back outside, and he continued to stare, his mind elsewhere and in many places. "Of course it'll work," he told himself. "They've all got watches, and I know they'll have synchronized them, even if they don't know how to spell synchronize. It's a shout like any other, and I've trained most of them, and I reckon that they know that if somebody says to them, 'Do you know who I am?' they know enough to say, 'Yes, you're nicked.'" And he smiled inwardly when he thought that among the officers drafted in from the city were 2 trolls 2 vampires, a werewolf, and a dwarf. That's what they probably call symbolic, he thought. He pulled out his own watch again. Just as the early seekers of an evening pint began to appear. Right about now. There was a huge jamming of coaches around the opera house as would-be patrons, high or low, forsook their carriages and took to their feet, fighting their way through the throng that was seeking admission. Of course, it helped if you had a squad of trolls or dwarves with you. Ankh-Morpork liked surprises, provided they didn't involve the revenue. The curtain was not due to go up for another hour, but that didn't matter, because the important thing was to be there, and even more importantly, to be seen to be there, especially by the people you wanted to see. Whatever it was going to be, it was going to be an occasion. And you would have been there, and people would have seen you there, and it was important, and therefore, so were you. It would be a night to remember, even if the mysterious performance was an act to forget. The really rich often put on these things out of vanity, but this one looked particularly mysterious, and possibly a jolly good laugh if it fell on its face. Day was turning into night. The pub was filling up, as were the drinkers, who had been told by Jiminy that they were drinking courtesy of Commander Vimes again. And Jiminy watched him carefully from the doorway as the shadows lengthened and Vimes stood there, motionless, occasionally looking at his watch. At last, the lad everybody knew as young Feeney turned up, with his arm still in its cast, but nevertheless, the old boys agreed amongst themselves, looking rather more grown-up than they'd ever seen him before. He was accompanied by Jefferson, the blacksmith, whom they regarded as a ticking bomb at the best of times, and he had a badge, just like Feeney. People overflowed from the pub as the two of them went up to Vimes, and there was an unheard conversation. They'd wondered why the blacksmith was carrying a megaphone. But now they watched him hand it to Vimes, and Feeney and the blacksmith walked back. But now they watched him hand it to Vimes, and Feeney and the blacksmith walked back toward the pub, and people parted like a wave to let them through. Vimes looked at his watch again. More people were hurrying toward the green. People with an instinct for the dramatic had run home to say that something was up and you'd better come and look. And country people liked a spectacle or even a serious death, just like city people. They too liked to say, "I was there," even if it came out as, "I was there. Ooh, arr." Vimes put his watch in his pocket for the last time and raised the megaphone to his lips. "Ladies and gentlemen," the blacksmith had hammered out a pretty good loud hailer, and the voice echoed across the green. "I have heard it said, ladies and gentlemen, that in the end all sins are forgiven." Out of the corner of his mouth, he said, so that only Feeney and the blacksmith could hear, "We shall see." And then he continued, "Bad things have been done. Bad things have been ordered. Bad orders have been obeyed. But they never will be again, will they, ladies and gentlemen? Because there needs to be a law. But before there is a law, there has to be a crime." There was absolute silence in the gloom, as he walked over the green to the tower and broke the 2 bottles of brandy on its woodwork, stepped back a little way, and threw the glowing end of his cigar after them. In the opera house, the gossip faded and died as Lady Sybil stepped through the curtains and onto the stage. She was a woman of, as they say, ample proportions, although she felt that some of them were more than ample. However, she could afford the very best dressmakers and did indeed have the manner and poise that were the symbol of her class, or at least the class she had been born into. And so she stepped out in front of the curtain, and applause broke out and grew. When she judged that it had gone on long enough, she made a little gesture which magically silenced the auditorium. Lady Sybil had exactly the right voice for these occasions. Somehow she could make everybody think she was talking just to them. She said, "My Lord Patrician, Lady Margolota, Your Grace the Viceroy, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, I am so touched you have all decided to come along to my little twilight soiree, especially since I have been rather naughty and have been very sparing of information." Lady Sybil took a deep breath, which caused several elderly gentlemen near the front of the audience to very nearly burst into tears. Footnote. It had been said by someone years before that to see Sybil Ramkin's upholstered bosom rise and fall was to understand the history of empires. End footnote. I have been privileged recently to find a musician beyond compare, and without more ado, I will let you into this wonderful secret. Can we have the house lights down, Geoffrey? Good. Ladies and gentlemen, I am honored to be able to present to you tonight Tears of the Mushroom, playing her own composition, The Twilight Serenade. I hope you will like it, and in fact, I know that you will. Lady Sybil stepped back as the curtains dragged themselves aside, and took a chair next to Tears of the Mushroom, who was seated obediently at her concert harp. Beneath this seemingly impregnable composure, Sybil's heart was bouncing like a flamenco dancer. A low light. That had been the thing. The girl shouldn't be able to see the thousands out there. Sybil had taken her in hand, fearful that sudden exposure to the masked gaze of Ankh-Morpork far from her home would have some terrible effect. But in fact, it wasn't working like that. The girl had a curious tranquility, as if she hadn't realized that she should be in awe. She smiled at Sybil in her strange way and waited, with fingers poised over the strings. There was no sound but the susurration of people asking one another what the intense little figure they were seeing really was. Lady Sybil smiled to herself. By the time they realized, it would be too late. She looked at her watch. Susurration, a whispering sound, a murmur, susurration. The flames were so high over the Ramkin estate that the blaze could surely be seen all the way to Ankh-Morpork. Bet you a gallon of brandy and a brace of turbot. Turbot, a large European flatfish. Scophithalmus maximus synonym Seta maxima, that is a popular food fish and has a brownish upper surface marked with scattered tubercles and white undersurface. Turbot, a flatfish. There was barely any wind, and it stood there like a beacon. Vimes announced to the gathered throng, "Ladies and gentlemen, the area known as the Shires is under the rule of law tonight, and by that I mean proper law, the law that is written down for everybody to see, and even to be changed if enough people agree. Chief Constable Upshot and Constable Jefferson are currently acting with the backing of their colleagues in the Ankh-Morpork City Watch, who would like to be assured that their colleagues receive the respect that is due. At this moment, a number of people from the Shires are being courteously brought here, although possibly to their dismay. Some of them will be the people who call themselves your magistrates, and they will be taken away and asked to explain to a lawyer by what right they have assumed that position. If any one of you wants to argue with me, please come on and do so. The law is there for the people, rather than the other way round. When it is the other way round, don't hesitate to grab your weapons. Understand? The bar is still free. But before you stampede, there is one more thing." Vimes had to put the megaphone back to his mouth, because the mention of bar and free in one breath was an invigorating effect on people. "Right now, ladies and gentlemen, the goblins on Hangman's Hill, and indeed all other goblins in this area, are under my protection and the protection of the law. They are also subject to it, and I'll see to it that they have their own police force. It appears that they make natural clacks operators, so if they wish, they can derive a revenue from doing so. I'm paying to have that clacks tower made permanent. You will benefit from it, and so will they. They won't need to steal your chickens because they'll buy them from you. And if they do pinch them, then that's a crime and will be treated as such. One law, ladies and gentlemen. One size fits all." There was a cheer at this. Hurrah! Hurrah! As loud as any cheer in the vicinity of the prospect of a free bar can be. Of course, some of it might have been cheer at the fact that there was now some justice in the world. But on the whole, it was quite likely that the bar won the day. You didn't have to be a cynic. You just had to understand people. Vimes walked slowly toward the brightly lit pub. Although the chances of getting inside were small, on the other hand, the chances of being given a hug by Miss Felicity Beadle were exactly 100%, because that was what she was doing, while being watched sheepishly by the blacksmith. Vimes let go of her hand as she said, "You are a great man, Commander, and I hope they put up a statue to you." "Oh dear, I hope not. You only get a statue when you're dead." She laughed. But Vimes said, "Listen, Miss Beadle, Right now, I don't know if I'm facing a statue or the sack. Some of the ways I've acted have been quite lawful, and others have been somewhat debatable. I have an officer who can do with numbers what Sergeant Detritus can do with a hammer, and he's going through the records of the son of one of the most influential people in Ankh-Morpork. And at the same time, experienced police officers have visited the home of every member on the list of local magistrates. They are presenting them with a document under my seal, informing them that they are no longer members of the self-elected Board of Magistrates of the Shires, and reiterating that there may be formal charges to be made. My justification for this ought to work, but now it's probably going to be a case of who has the best lawyers. The future, Miss Beadle, is somewhat uncertain, but I have to tell you that young Sam, thanks to you, is probably going to be the world expert on poo. I must tell you that his mother and I are very pleased and only hope he aspires to higher things. There was already the rattle of wagons and coaches in the distance. The sound of pigeons coming home to roost. I think I'll soon have people to talk to, Miss Beadle, although I suspect that they'd rather not talk to me. Of course, Commander. Can I say that the goblins seem very attached to your Corporal Nobbs? They treat him as one of their own. In fact, he seems to be very fond of Shine of the Rainbow, as she is of him. You may be interested to know that the goblin name for him is Breaking Wind. She did not appear to smile, and Vimes said, Yes, very apt. I've always thought of Nobby as a draft intruder. In fact, at my wife's express suggestion, I have breveted him to the rank of sergeant for his stay here, and I hope that he'll assist the goblins to understand the benefits of the law. Although, of course, the fusion might simply mean that people's chickens will be more expertly stolen from now on. Oh, you are a joker, Commander! Vimes's expression had not changed, and did not change now. Yes, aren't I? He turned to Jefferson. You know things would have been a lot easier if you trusted me at the start. The blacksmith shrugged. Why should I have trusted you? You're a knob. Do you trust me now? The blacksmith's gaze remained steady for longer than Vimes could be happy with. But at last the man smiled and said, Yeah, for now. There was only one reply that Vimes could conceivably deliver. He smiled back and said, A policeman's answer if ever I heard one. As the couple strolled away, there was a polite cough behind Vimes. Ahem. He turned around and recognized the worried face of the colonel. Do you have a minute, Commander? Oh dear, thought Vimes. May I first say, Commander, that I firmly agree with what you are doing, and heavens know it needed doing. The colonel coughed again and said, You will not have any disagreement with me on that point. Vimes waited and continued. My wife is a rather foolish woman who does appear to worship things like titles and, if I may say so, gives herself airs. Her father was a fisherman, an extremely good one. But do you know what? I think she would rather die than have anyone know. There was another pause, and in the red light, Vimes could see the shine on the old man's face. What is going to happen to her, Commander? At the moment, 2 polite young ladies in Ankh-Morpork City Watch uniform are standing guard over her in our house. I don't know if this helps very much, but the first thing she did when the arresting officers arrived was make them tea. There is such a thing as good manners, you see. Is she going to prison? Vimes felt the urge to say, "Would you like her to?" But he choked it back because of the tears. "It's Charles, isn't it?" The colonel looked surprised. "As a matter of fact, Commander, it's Chas to my friends." "And am I one of them?" And Vimes went on. "Other people will decide what has to be done here. I've merely made certain that nobody can inadvertently leave before I've had a chance to talk to them all. Do you understand? I'm not the judge, and nor would I be allowed to sit on a jury. Coppers aren't. And right now I'm not even certain what the penalty is for being stupid, vain and unthinking. Although it does occur to me that if I was to put in prison every person guilty of these crimes, we'd have to build about 500 more. Speaking for myself," Vimes continued, "I'd like to see that murderers, if such I might find, are seen and dealt with as murderers, and the frightened and unthinking obedient also treated as they deserve. And right now, sir, I'd just like not to be living in a world of bloody fools. Personally, I have no particular interest in seeing your wife in prison, although I have a suspicion that if she was put in the women's wing of the Tanti, her horizon would be usefully expanded, and I expect she'd be so bossy that she'd be running the place after a couple of weeks." "I do love her, you know," said the colonel. "We've been married for 55 years. I'm very sorry you've been troubled, and, as I've said, I envy you your job." "I think perhaps I should envy her husband," said Vimes. "You know, Colonel, I'll be happy just for the truth to come out, preferably on page 1 of the Ankh-Morpork Times, if you understand me." "Absolutely, Commander." Vimes looked down at the man, who now looked rather relieved, and added, "For what it's worth, I suspect Lord Veterinary will make certain of his backing, and possibly there will be some token punishments. Too many skeletons, you see. Too many cupboards, too many things around the world that maybe happened too long ago. What in the world can you do if some copper is going to go around digging them up? That's called real politic, sir. And so I suspect that the world will go on, and you will not be very long without the company of your wife, which should, if I'm any judge, mean that you can have more or less anything for dinner that you want for the next week." The idea seemed to uplift the colonel's spirits. The old man smiled. "Do you know, Commander, I'm sure that, if treated with respect, potted shrimps might turn out to be my bosom chums." The colonel held out his hand, and Vimes took it, shook it, and said, "Bon appetit." Afterward, there were several explanations about why the quern wagon containing a very important prisoner overturned in the middle of the night and rolled down a very steep hill, coming to bits as it did so. You could blame the dark. You could blame the fog. You could blame its speed, and above all, you could blame the express mail coach from Ankh-Morpork that ran straight into it on the corner. By the time the wounded were in any state to comprehend what had happened, they were minus one prisoner, who appeared to have picked the lock of his shackles, and plus one guard whose throat had been cut. It was dark, it was cold, it was foggy, and, hunched together, the survivors waited until dawn. After all, how could you find a man in darkness? Stratford was good at speed. Speed was always useful, and he stayed on the road that was just visible in the murk. It didn't really matter where he went, after all. He knew no one had ever given a description of him that helped. It was a gift to be indescribable. After a while, however, he was surprised and delighted to hear a horse trotting along the road behind him. Some brave traveller, he thought, and smiled in the fog and waited. To his further surprise, the horse was reined to a halt a little way from him, and the rider slid off. Stratford could barely make out a shape in the shimmering, water-laden air. "My word, the famous Mr. Stratford," said a voice cheerfully as the stranger strolled toward him. "And let me tell you right now, if you make any kind of move, you'll be so dead that the graveyards would have to run backward." "I know you. Vimes sent you after me." "Oh, dear me, no, sir," said Willikins. "The commander doesn't know I'm here at all, sir, and nor will he ever. That is a certainty. No, sir. I'm here, as it might be, out of a matter of professional pride. By the way, sir, if you're thinking of killing me and taking my horse, I'd be most grateful if you'd try that right now." Stratford hesitated. There was something about the voice that induced hesitation. It was calm, friendly, and worrying. Willikins strolled a little closer, and there was a chuckle in his voice. "Oh, my word, sir, I'm a bit of a fighter myself, and when I heard about you chopping up that girl and that, I thought, goodness me, I thought. And so the other day, when I had my day off in lieu, very important your day off in lieu, if you're a working man, I took a trip up to Overhang and learned a few things about you. And, my word, did I learn a few things. You really scare people, eh?" Stratford still hesitated. This didn't sound right. The man had a straightforward and cheerful voice, like a man you didn't know very well, having a companionable chat in the pub. And Stratford was used to people being very nervous when they spoke to him. "Now, me," said Willikins, "I was raised by the street as a fighter, and I fight dirty. You can depend on that, and I'll fight anybody. But I never punched a girl. Oh, except Kinky Elise, who was always game for that sort of thing, and had me by the, I'm not going to mention at the time, and my hands were tied, in more ways than one, as it were. And so I had to give her a sharp nudge with my foot. Happy days. But you're just a killer. Worthless. A bully. I fight because I might get killed and the other bloke might win. Or maybe we'd both end up in the gutter, too weak to throw another punch, when, quite likely, we'd prop each other up and go to the pub for a drink and a wash." He took another step closer. Stratford took a step back. "And you, Mr. Stratford, set out to kill Commander Vimes' little lad, or worse. And do you know what is even worser? I reckon that if you'd done so, the commander would have arrested you and dragged you to the nearest police station. But inside, he'd be cutting himself up with razor blades from top to bottom, and he'd be doing that because the poor bugger is scared that he could be as bad as you." Willikins laughed. "Truth is, Mr. Stratford, from where I sits, he's a choir boy. He really is. But there has to be some justice in the world, you see. Not necessarily law justice, but justice. And that's why I am going to kill you. Although, because I'm a fair man, I'm going to give you a chance to kill me first. That means One or other of us will die. So whatever happens, the world is going to be a better place. Eh? Call it cleaning up. I know you have a weapon because you'd have run if you didn't. And so I reckon you have a blade from one of those poor buggers from Quirm, and I warrant that in all the confusion you probably stabbed him with it. I did that too, said Stratford, and he was a copper, and you're just a butler. Very true, said Willikins, and much older than you, and heavier than you, and slower than you, but still a bit spry. What have you got to lose? Only the horse, steaming patiently in the mist, saw what happened next, and being a horse, was in no position to articulate its thoughts on the matter. Had it been able to do so, it would have given as its opinion that one human ran toward another human carrying a huge metal stick, while the other human, quite calmly, put his hand into his breast pocket. This was followed by a terrible scream, a gurgling noise, and then silence. Willikins staggered to the side of the road and sat down on a stone, panting a little. Stratford certainly had been fast, no doubt about that. He wiped his forehead with his sleeve, pulling out a packet of cigarettes, and lit one, staring at nothing but the fog. Then he stood up, looked down at the shadow on the ground and said, "But not fast enough." Then, like a good citizen, Willikins went back to see if he could help the unlucky gentleman of the law, who appeared to be in difficulties. You should always help the gentlemen of the law. Where would we be without them? The chief sub-editor of the Ankh-Morpork Times really hated poetry. He was a plain man and had devoted a large part of his career to keeping it out of his paper. But they were a cunning bunch, poets who could sneak it up on you when your back was turned. And tonight, with the paper already so late that the lads downstairs were into overtime, he stared at the report just delivered by hand from Natchbull Harrington, the paper's music critic. A man of whom he was deeply suspicious. He turned to his deputy and waved the page angrily. "Whence came it, that ethereal music? See what I mean? What's wrong with them? Where did that music come from? Bloody stupid introductory sentence in any case. And what does ethereal mean anyway?" The deputy sub hesitated. "I think it means runny. Could be wrong." The chief sub-editor stood in misery. "Definitely poetry." Somebody had played some music that was very good. Apparently, it made everybody amazed. Why didn't that twit in his rather feminine purple silk shirts just write something like that? After all, it said everything that you needed to know, didn't it? He took out his red pencil, and just as he was applying it to the wretched manuscript, there was a sound on the metal staircase, and Mr. De Word, the editor, staggered into the office, looking as if he had seen a ghost, or perhaps a ghost had seen him. He looked groggily at the two puzzled men and managed to say, "Did Harrington send in his stuff?" The chief sub held out the offending stuff in front of him. "Yes, Gov, a load of rubbish in my opinion." De Word grabbed it, read it with his lips, moving and thrusting it back at the man. "Don't you dare change a single word. Front page, Bugsy. And I hope to hell that Otto got an iconograph." "Yes, sir, but, sir, and don't bloody argue," screamed De Word. "And now, if you'll excuse me, I'll be in my office." He clattered on up the stairs, while the sub-editor and his deputy stood gloomily reading Natchbull Harrington's copy again. it began. Whence came it, that ethereal music? From what hidden grot or secret cell? From what dark cave? From what window into paradise? We watched the tiny figure under the spotlight, and the music poured over us, sometimes soothing, sometimes blessing, sometimes accusing. Every one of us confronting ghosts, demons, and old memories. The recital by Tears or the Mushroom, a young lady of the goblin persuasion, took but half an hour, or perhaps it took a lifetime, and then it was over. 'Twas silence which spread and grew and expanded until at last it exploded. Every single patron standing and clapping their hands raw, tears running down our faces. We had been taken somewhere and brought back, and we were different people, longing for another journey into paradise, no matter what hell we had to atone for on the way. The chief sub and his deputy looked at each other with what Natchbull would certainly have called a wild surmise. At last, the deputy sub-editor ventured. "I think he liked it."